But how do you actually bring this down to a concrete set of what you call dimensions of value? Could you say what are some of the dimensions of value and why do I care?
One of the examples I use often, as you suggest, George, is the example of a police department. And in trying to get at the question of what important dimensions of value ought to define performance or define the public value that a police department is trying to produce, I ask the students to take up particular roles. And so I ask one student, I say, okay, well, you're a victim of crime. Somebody just came in and took a lot of your money and scared your family. Now, what is it that you want from the police department? And people can put themselves in that position without too much struggle and say, well, I guess I'd like a police department that solved the crime and got me my property back. And I'd like to see the justice system call the offender to account in some way that seemed to honor the fact that that person injured me and had done something wrong. Um, and I'd like all that to happen as quickly and reliably as possible. And say, okay, well, that's sort of the perspective of the victim of crime. Now let's talk about the criminal. What kind of a police department would a criminal like? And the answer to that's not very hard to give either. You say, well, would you like the police department to be large or small? Well, I'd like it to be small. Competent or incompetent? Well, I'd like it to be incompetent. And they say, okay, well, how would you like to be treated if this small, incompetent police department managed to catch you? The answer is, oh, I'd like to have my rights respected and at least that, and maybe even some recognition of my humanity, even though I've committed this crime. Say, okay, I got that. And then you go and say, well, now you're now a taxpayer. What kind of a police department would a taxpayer like to have? And you think about that and you say, well, if I'm strictly speaking just a taxpayer, I think what I want is cheap, ideally, and the smaller the police department, the better. So you say, okay, well, we've got it now then. So now let's add up these different individuals and see what dimensions of value are there and whether they can agree on them or not. And the answer, I think, looking at it is you say, oh, well, look, they've got each has nominated a particular dimension of value from their particular position as important. All right. And we could disqualify some of them or uh, increase the standing of some of those people relative to the others in terms of how important it would be that we acknowledge the values they held in the design of a police department. But it's clear that if they're just thinking in those terms, they're not going to be able to agree on what constitutes a good police department. So that seems and is known to be a fundamental problem in governance and democratic governance in particular. But the philosopher John Rawls had a very interesting solution to that problem. He said, well, let's suppose there's one person in a position that I didn't mention, which is a citizen, as opposed to a criminal offender, a victim of crime, or a taxpayer. So there's somebody out there called a citizen, and maybe that's the person whose views we ought to take seriously. And you say, well, what do you mean by a citizen? And what Rawls would have said was, well, a citizen would be a person who's thinking about what a good police department would be without knowing what particular position he would occupy in the society. So that person wouldn't know whether he was going to be an offender or a victim or a taxpayer. He's just living in a society where he could end up in any of those roles. And then the question is knowing that, how would that citizen decide what it is that he or she would like as a police department? And I think that you can see that if you could take that exercise seriously, you might decide on a police department that could provide a reasonable amount of value in each of the dimensions that were previously nominated as important to each of the other individual positions that we've identified. And if you think about that a little bit, you realize that what we're trying to get at here is a set of dimensions that would be nominated by individuals that are affected by a problem and then get included or not included and weighted or unweighted, all right, um, by some neutral principle that says you don't know as an individual which of these positions you're going to end up in. So please decide on a particular set of values that you would choose as an individual not knowing what particular position you were going to occupy, or more particularly, learning to think like a citizen. And when you think about that, it turns out to be important because all of us would like to spend less money on a police department, but we'd like to have enough to be effective in controlling crime. All of us would like to have a police department that would be effective in controlling crime, but each of us would be indignant if, in the process of trying to control crime, our individual rights were offended, or we were disproportionately punished by society for minor crimes that we committed, or unfairly selected for that things. So the idea is you have multiple dimensions, and then those dimensions get evaluated by individuals and by a collective. Ideally, the individuals thinking and acting like citizens, and the collective acting collectively to identify and try to find the best way to advance all of those dimensions of value as best we can simultaneously.
Mark, there was a lot there. I want to grab a couple points and just highlight them, and then I want to ask you another question. One thing I really appreciated was this idea of a citizen, because you're assuming that a citizen can weigh these different things and that they are willing to do that. And I'll just say from my own experience, I live in a bubble. Like in a lot of times I'm in a bubble. And so I think of things in a certain way. And so I think one of the things that you've taught me through our interactions over the years has been, no, go place yourself with each of those affected parties. Now come back and pretend to be a citizen, but don't assume you can be a citizen until you've actually taken up those roles. And I just want to point that out because it's been extremely valuable for me to understand that, because now once you've heard those things, you can try to be a citizen. You still may not do a perfect job, but you can start to say, well, wait a minute, it wasn't just how I was affected. There's all sorts of other people that I really need to hear their voice and understand that to come up with this, set of dimensions of value that we would pay attention to as a citizen and as a citizen of a larger society.